Welcome to the Institute for Government. I'm Federica Cocco. I'm a statistics journalist at the Financial Times, and we're here today to talk about open data and open government and whether that does anything to help government be more effective. We're going to have the panelists talk for 5 minutes, and then we're going to open the floor to you for any questions. We're going to start with Jeni, the CEO of the Open Data Institute. And Ben? Oh, I'm really sorry. We've got Ben Worthy, an expert on FOI and an academic at Birkbeck. He teaches public policy and research methods. Then Jeni. And then we've got Gavin Freeguard, who works here as a data expert at the Institute for Government. Over to you. Sorry.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Worthy. I'm a lecturer in politics based at Birkbeck College, University of London. I've been studying freedom of information and open data for my sins for the past 10 years or so. I've just published a book called The Politics of Freedom of Information, Why and How Governments Pass Laws That Limit Their Power. It is available to buy, but I won't tell you how much it is. The argument that governments are made more efficient by transparency has been around for several decades, although it does come with a few caveats, which is A, it's very hard to prove, and B, it all feeds into this ongoing narrative that government is somehow inefficient. When we spoke to people in central government and local government, the first thing they said when we asked them about efficiency was, yes, but are you saying we're already inefficient? However, if you think in the abstract how this might work, I think there's two main routes in which transparency could make government more efficient. Route one is if people use information or data to expose inefficiencies in some way, shape or form. And secondly, there's the kind of anticipated reactions effect. The mere existence of a law actually might make people behave better. So I'm just going to very briefly go through some of the evidence for and against this. So thinking about the kind of exposure and fire alarm principle, of course, freedom of information has been used to highlight misspending, as we know, with MPs' expenses. And up and down the country at local government level, there's been sort of changes to credit card use and how money's spent. David Cameron, who was once Prime Minister, famously argued that open data would create this army of armchair auditors. And this was the idea, stick with me on this, that we would spend our evenings going through local government and central government PDFs, checking how they've spent their money and why. As you can imagine, this didn't quite take off, but there has been some examples of it happening. But the point really is that there's a very long chain between the kind of idea of getting the information and then creating the accountability. There's also a further problem in that kind of highlighting inefficiency feeds the narrative that government, central and local level is somehow grossly inefficient, which isn't necessarily the case. The anticipated reactions effect, the kind of mere existence of the law, is a little bit more problematic. There is one group of people who say that actually the arrival of freedom of information, openness laws, makes decision making worse. This is the so-called chilling effect. The idea that the existence of a law means that people don't record information in the same way. They have meetings in the corridor, meetings on the phone, and there's a damage to the decision-making process. This is advocated by people such as Gus O'Donnell, Tony Blair, and David Cameron. And David Cameron also talked about FOI as, very famously, a buggeration factor that was gluing up what a leader could do. Interestingly, on the other hand, there is some academic research that shows by talking about transparency, you empower records managers, you make people think more seriously about how they hold information. And we found when we looked at local government level, there was a sense that there was better communications, a sort of professionalising effect on how organisations worked internally. So to conclude, it's difficult to say there's been a systematic effect either way, but there has been some examples of improvement. What's really fascinating when you look at this is that there's often parallel conversations. Tony Blair says one thing's happening, the evidence says something else, and people have a tendency to believe Tony Blair, rather unusually. And then it also reveals something else that's rather interesting, which is that politicians imagine that transparency policies have this huge constituency of neutral, activist, engaged citizens who will use it in the way that they want. And I have to admit, having looked at this for 10 years, that's pretty largely a myth. Thank you.
So I'm Jeni Tennison, I'm CEO at the Open Data Institute, and what we really concentrate on there is building a strong, fair and sustainable data economy where data can get to the people that really need it. So we focus on openness, though, as an enabler for that, as a tool for change. I thought that you might concentrate on the transparency aspects of openness. I'm going to look at openness in a bit broader, in 5 categories. So first category is openness in terms of transparency, which is what Ben has just been talking about. And I'm not going to go into that because you've talked about that in great detail. But for me then, the argument around efficiency providing government effectiveness is not necessarily proved, right? Is a more efficient government necessarily a more effective government? Well, it depends on what you are aiming for. So I was going to concentrate on 4 other areas of where openness makes a difference. One is around participation and open government, around delivery and openness in order to create impact, different ways of working with data. Openness as a way of having an international effect, and openness in terms of culture within organisations. So openness in terms of participation is much more than publishing data. It's much more than simply putting stuff out there or responding to FOI requests. It's about a proper engagement with a community. And when you look at open government partnership, or you look at the open contracting partnership, then the open data aspects of those, the publication of data, is just one part of what they're really pushing for. It's much more about dialogue between, in particular, government and civil society. It's about effective consultation, meaningful consultation. You can even see participation as being about user needs research, like actually talking to people about what it is that they want and need, and the co-design of policy and open policy making practices, right? So open government in terms of driving participation, we can see as being effective at a different kind of, not at driving efficiencies, but in responding to the demands of the populace, potentially. And maybe we can dig into some of the ways in which that isn't true after everybody's spoken. Second area around delivery. So I think here then, when government sees that it has a whole range of actors that it can empower in order to achieve its policy objectives, that's a different form of openness that government can engage in. So when it sees that it can use civil society, when it sees that it can use business in order to deliver things, I think that gives government a different form of way of creating impact that is driven by or enabled by openness with those different types of actors. So the kinds of things that I'm thinking about there are things like the Open Active project, which we're engaging in at the moment, which seeks to get people more active using the availability of data to help people know where they can be more active and therefore drive that behaviour. And there what you see is government acting as a standard setter, as an enabler, as an organisation that provides incentives for other people to act, and that openness in delivery is what's important. Next area is in being open internationally. So if you look at the British Standards Institute, it was set up in order to promote British standards internationally. There's something about creating standards and particularly being open about those standards, which is about influencing the world and being using our soft power, if you like. So being open about what we do within the UK is a way of influencing what other people do internationally. And I think that we should see openness as a tool there as well. And my final category is about open culture. So open organisations occur all over the place, and sometimes they even occur in government. And by an open organisation, I mean one that really drives the sharing of ideas and knowledge, that is a fairly flat structure in which everybody can contribute, in which there is an emphasis on participation by everybody within the organisation. And there I would see that kind of typified by what Claire Moriarty is leading on in DEFRA and the kind of open culture that she is trying to build there. And if you don't know about that, then there's a great ODI Summit talk from her. Now, that has really big challenges for people in government. It requires boldness. It requires openness to critique and to admitting failure that is extremely difficult to have within government. But that kind of open culture, I think, can be effective, particularly in a fast-moving area. So my summary of those things is that you can have these different forms of openness. There are lots of different forms of openness. It's not just transparency. And they give different kinds of forms of effectiveness. So transparency maybe reduces costs and provides efficiency. Participation maybe makes you more responsive to what citizens really need. Being open around how you deliver public policy can enable you to have a wider impact. Being open about standards internationally can mean that you influence the world. Being open about your culture can mean that you are more able to change rapidly when you need to. So really, in thinking about openness for governance, you think about what kind of effect you want to have before you decide what kind of openness you want to use for it.
So I'm Gavin Freeguard, Head of Data and Transparency here at the Institute. Is open government more effective government? Well, in the spirit of the election campaign that we're currently seeing, I'm going to give a straight answer to that question, to which the straight answer is probably, but, ... So I think we often take it to be self-evident and logical that open government is good for accountability. Parliament, press and the public has more information to hold government to account. For effectiveness, in terms of a lot of the things that Jeni's already talked about, more eyeballs on particular bits of data, creating greater insight, greater participation, but also embedding good culture within government, forcing them to eat their own dog food, according to a particular strand of thinking, but also good for innovation. This is the obligatory mention of City Mapper and various other transport apps which use open data to create businesses, but also to create social benefit in terms of getting you home on time. So if all of this is self-evidently and logically good, why are we asking this question and why are we asking it now? Well, a lot of our friends in the United States would say that President Trump is turning back a lot of the good work on open government and transparency over there, and they're worried that the transparency which they've espoused has actually contributed to a political outcome that they're not in favour of. And over here, of course, we've now got Brexit, which has pushed open government down the political agenda, and I think it'd be fair to say that Theresa May's direction on transparency isn't entirely clear. Now, as a person who works for a think tank, I'm obliged to say the question that we're faced with tonight is a really interesting question, but actually the question we should really be asking is something completely different. I just want to throw another question in briefly to try to answer some of this, which is, why would closed government be more effective than open government? So a few reasons why closed government might be more effective that we sometimes hear. First is that it provides a safe space for policymakers. It allows them to think the unthinkable, protected from prying public and press eyes. Well, actually, the Freedom of Information Act has exemptions which allow that to happen. And in fact, if you look at the birth of the UK Freedom of Information Act, the baptism of FOIA, if you will, this was actually something... Apologies. I've got a lot more of those for later. If you actually look at the white paper, Your Right to Know, it actually said that unnecessary secrecy can lead to arrogance in governance and defective decision-making. It actually thought that by opening up the culture and bringing more people into the policy-making process, there's actually a benefit. A second reason for closed government over open government might be that it's cheaper. Undoubtedly, there is a resource ask in opening things up. You need particular expertise, you need civil servants to be working on that. Now, over the last few years, we've seen a 20% reduction in civil service headcount. Most departments have seen reductions to their day-to-day spending budgets, and of course, things like Brexit have pushed open government down the list of government priorities. But openness has been shown to actually save money in some instances. There's a famous example of Mastodon C, which the Open Data Institute incubated, looking through prescription data and finding millions of pounds worth of savings. I saw a few weeks ago that the London Borough of Camden has managed to save £200,000 by using open data in terms of planning applications. And actually, there are probably lots of other examples where opening up can help face these bigger challenges. Finally, why might closed government be more effective? Well, there's less political risk. Now, politicians are obviously quite important in this. They set a lot of the direction, and opening things up for them can be quite a courageous thing to do. The default setting, therefore, is normally to be a bit more closed. There's a great quote from the data-driven former Mayor of Baltimore and Governor of Maryland, Martin O'Malley. He said, "Effective leaders make themselves vulnerable. Own the goals of the government you run and the people you lead, or no one else will." O'Malley was very open about what he wanted to achieve in public services. He was therefore very open about it. He wanted to know what was really going on. Some of those numbers pointed in the wrong direction, but actually that gave him more political credibility to achieve what he wanted to achieve in the long run. Now, earlier this week, the Open Government Network Steering Group, of which I'm a member, wrote to all the political parties and asked for the most transparent Brexit negotiation process possible. Now, negotiations are one of those areas which it might feel natural to be secretive in. We might think that that's more effective. But actually, as some work that the Institute will be publishing over the next week or so will show, there's quite a lot of evidence that being transparent can strengthen your negotiating position, can help you avoid making bad decisions, and actually bring people with you politically. And I think it's that evidence point which is really important, because if we want to move beyond open government being self-evidently and logically a good thing, we've got to find the evidence that open government is more effective government, the evidence that it will help politicians and governments achieve what they want to achieve. And therefore, we need to be showing, as a civil society community, as an open government community, as those of us who care about effective government, that openness and transparency is not just about accountability, but also effectiveness. It's not just about principle, but also pragmatism. And it's not just about obligations, it's also about opportunities.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to open some questions. I actually have a couple of thoughts before I get you to intervene. This is quite interesting for me as a journalist who works a lot with data and statistics, because I see two obstacles, and for me the question isn't does government become more effective as it becomes more open. For me the question is it making government more accountable? And the two obstacles, from my point of view, aren't necessarily what is available and is the government actually withholding data. For me, there is plenty of information out there, and it's hidden in footnotes and in those numbers that are out there. The problem is, one, that there are not that many people, citizens, journalists, and others, who are willing to experiment and to challenge themselves with data. It's a bit scary for a lot of people, including some of my colleagues. There are some political journalists who are not willing to go in there, and there's an element of culture in that. Number two, it's, for example, Gavin, you said that it's very expensive. But on the other hand, there's no need to produce more information, it's just a matter of communicating it better. And from my perspective, government isn't very good at doing that. It's very obscure and opaque in the way that it's written. And there's a lot of caveats, for example, when you're looking for information that might help you build a story. So those are two thoughts that were running through my head as I was listening to you. And the other thing is that perhaps it's too soon, like when you, Jeni, were listing all these processes of participation and delivery and standards, I feel like it's just begun. And since things have started, from my perspective, or the perspective of my job, it's improved quite a lot. So I feel like maybe a metric of success in terms of effectiveness is whether it makes my job easier. Which, you know, as selfish as it sounds, it's my job to communicate it, and it's other journalists' jobs as well. Anyways, those were just some of my thoughts. If anyone wanted to ask a question, or if you guys wanted to address that first. Please.
Ulrike Hohthoff, I'm an economist, former chief economist at DEFRA.
Thank you. Ulrike Hohthoff, economist. I have a question with respect to the amount of data that is sometimes put out. I remember in DEFRA we had a target to put 8,000 data sets out, including all sorts of obscure data about, well, very important, but about water quality, about marine quality, about all sorts of things, just to get to 8,000 data. And it seemed to me that was hiding more than anything else.
I'll just take two more. There's a gentleman at the back.
Hi, Brian Wheeler from BBC. Just picking up on what Gavin said, really. I just wondered if you could give me a sense of where you think we are in terms of open data. I mean, this feels like a debate that was going on in 2010, and how deeply have the changes that have been made by the last two governments been embedded, and has it kind of reached its high watermark now? Are we, you know, is there any sense that the main parties have got this anywhere near at the top of their agenda, or even on their agenda?
I'll just take two more. There's a lady there, and then there's a...
It's, yeah, just to follow on, my name's Caroline McFarlane from Common Vision. Following on from your point, Federica, and also the lady's point, we hear a lot, especially in our work on taxation, both in terms of public and private sector standards, that data and disclosing data isn't enough. It's you can dump lots of information on people, but it's actually encouraging that understanding and giving people what they want to know and want to see, rather than sort of just dumping lots of information on them. So the question is, what do you think needs to be done alongside data and open data disclosures to help that?
Thank you. Una Muirhead. I'm a non-executive director on a number of public and private sector bodies. And I really do firmly believe in the sort of disinfecting power of sunlight as a non-executive director. I mean, as a board member, you kind of need that information from the organisation in order to drive effectiveness, efficiency, and all the rest, and all the things that, you know, a number of you have been talking about, particularly Jeni and Gavin. But I think that the agenda's sort of become very confused by, if you like, the all-embracing nature of freedom of information, and the fact that it's not necessarily channeled, and it's obviously open to people, you know, getting on there, you know, asking about some pet subject or other ad infinitum and causing a lot of work that doesn't necessarily drive effectiveness and efficiency. And I think that bit of it is kind of probably over-exaggerated and used as a reason to kind of explain why open government is not necessarily the best thing since sliced bread. So I'd really kind of like to, in that context, ask the panel whether there are any sort of aspects of open government that they would really think would be things that we need to push ahead with, and not get distracted by the overall, you know, worries about freedom of information and what it does to ministers having conversations in corridors, or not having, you know, writing their decision-making process down. Because it seems to me, you know, thinking about data that is useful for example, police and crime commissioners, for boards of companies, etc. It's data that is relevant to the organisation, relevant to driving that organisation, whether it be government or a small organisation, forward and making it better for citizens, rather than sort of necessarily sort of haphazard, any 40,000 sets of data from DEFRA or whatever the statistic happens to be, which just sounds like something that, well, Christ, how do we make up our target for pushing out data sets? So just if the panel could think about, what are the best forms of open government amongst all of those kind of elements of it that we have at the moment, or could have.
Thanks. Should we do it in the same order? Unless if you wanted to start then.
I'll have a go at those 4 questions in order. Hitting the target but missing the point, as Christopher had put it. It's very Soviet to have this number of kind of, seen as a Marxist theme this week, to have these kind of data-driven targets. There's some fascinating research from the United States which showed that only a small number of departments were publishing most of the data, and a lot of them were reluctant, not because they didn't want the public to see it, but they didn't want other departments to see it and expose them in future kind of spending rounds. The point about open data, I think most politicians are always kind of only ever half-heartedly committed to open government and open data anyway, and they very easily go off it. I think maybe the idea of open data needs to be seen within a kind of wider, what people have described as an ecosystem. If we think about all the different ways which we can get information out of government, from kind of Snowden, freedom information, open data, actually there's a wonderful kind of range of different tools which all are utterly unpredictable and do make government accountable. One argument in favour of open data is that it's not about the glitzy front, but it's about what's happening behind the scenes that's really important. So, for example, the government's review of all the data sets it holds through its national information infrastructure and these other records management, less interesting areas where government might actually be making advances. In terms of what could be helped, I mean, open data transparency is very political, and you need to remember it connects to other political tools to make it work, other ways of making government accountable. So people need to be given other tools to engage in local and central politics. And this leads to the final point. Where does freedom of information matter? Bob Morris, who's in the audience here, was with me at the Constitution Unit when we did a long study of local government. And the thing we really discovered, remember, is that transparency is primarily local. It's about people. We estimated that 4 in every 5 FOI requests go to local government. It's a tool for making a difference for what we described as micro-politics, the small things that people do with politics. It's not about, the Iraqs, the Attorney General's legal advice. It's about people getting hold of information and data that makes a difference to their life. And just going to your point about Theresa May, it's about leadership as well. It requires leaderships within departments, leadership from the very top to really push transparency as an important issue.
Oh, Jeni?
I'll simply go through in order. So the DEFRA 8,000 dataset target, which was actually beaten, I think they published 12,000 overall. So I thought that was ridiculous when it came out. I don't think that it's good to put a number on data sets to say this is publishing some number of data sets, some larger number is better than publishing some smaller number of data sets. What really matters is what you do with it. But I think what happened at DEFRA that is interesting is that the fact that that number was so large and so ridiculously large was a forcing function on the way in which they handled their data throughout the organisation, on the way in which they interacted with each other between DEFRA itself and the various NGBs that they had to interact with. So it's less about what that target was and actually about the change that it drove in becoming a more open organisation for me. In terms of where we are on open data from a party political perspective, do the parties care about anything other than position on Brexit right now? I don't know. I think what we've seen, though, is the wrapping of open data into the industrial strategy, into the digital strategy, into the transformation strategy. So it's not about seeing open data as a tool for transparency and accountability that is driving politicians' interest in it. It is much more about seeing open data as a tool for building a strong digital economy. And so for me, that is the angle that is most effective to push politically around open data. What needs to be done alongside opening data, it's not enough to just put all this data out there, is absolutely correct. We talk about 3 areas that you need to push on. One is around getting the infrastructure right, so making sure that the data that you're putting out there is right, but also the policies are correct around it and work. Secondly, building on skills, so ensuring that there's the skills both kind of within government but also in the wider populace to actually use that data. And the third is around driving innovation, so actually prompting the use of data for particular ends, trying to enable small businesses or large businesses to take up that data and do something with it. And that requires some promotions, some incentives. It doesn't just happen that people take data off the shelf and do something wonderful with it, apart from in a few very special cases. So in terms of what aspects of open government to push ahead with, which I think was the last question, for me, then the things that are most likely to be effective in terms of impact in the world are those kinds of delivery openness pieces that I was talking about. It's about government engaging with purposefully using data as a tool to engage with multiple stakeholders in order to achieve their policy objectives. And I think for having those kinds of very focused, sector-specific programs of work that bring together a whole bunch of people is the thing that is really enables us to see change.
I'd echo an awful lot of what Jeni and Ben said, actually, in terms of the DEFRA big number. Again, as Jeni said, I think it's the success of it seems to have been that it drove the behaviours they wanted to encourage. So it wasn't just about the number, it was about all of those arm's length bodies starting to work with one another, say, oh, actually, we didn't realise you had that number over there, we can start using that. They started to talk to each other, interact with each other in a completely different way. And the department and its group of organisations have started running in a slightly different way. There's also quite an interesting thing about publishing lots of stuff, in that one of the big thoughts behind open data is that you don't quite know what people are going to do with some of the data sets you've got, and it's not until you put them out there in the wild that you know what value people might get out of them. There might be quite an interesting tension there with trying to get people to use the data and try to get politicians in particular to see the value of data, but I think that's why you might publish things you wouldn't expect to be valuable, perhaps. In terms of where the agenda is at the moment, I think there's something in what we've already discussed about it being a little bit too early to say. This is quite an early moment still in terms of the development of everything. I think on the plus side, we now have lots of very dedicated civil servants, many of them in this room, and I'm trying not to embarrass them by catching their eye, who've sort of learned how to do this and drive this through government and get government to use data in a particular way. And I think it does come back to that mainstreaming point. Are we at a point where, rather than seeing things as open data or open government, and all of us talking in terms that might not mean that much to that many people, government actually starts to use the open data to get the objectives that it wants. As well as policy objectives, I think there's also something in using management information to run itself more effectively, something that we run up against quite a lot in our work on Whitehall Monitor and Performance Tracker at the Institute, and whether government is using that properly to work out how it should be operating, how public services are running, and how it can do all of those things better. In terms of what comes alongside and what comes next, I think we shouldn't underestimate that there's still quite a bit of work to be done in better opening up some important data sets that already exist. PACAC, the Political Affairs and Constitution, the Political Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee published a report on government accounts a few weeks ago, which said that actually this data still isn't being published in a way that Parliament or civil society can use, and made a number of recommendations for making it comparable and allowing people to actually understand what a lot of it meant. So still some work to be done on that. A lot of this also goes back to the earlier point about armchair auditors. That was a great aspiration in terms of what state you wanted the data to be in that anybody could use it. but it was naive insofar as you do need some specialists who are able to translate some of that to the public. So it's almost a wider fourth estate, which might include organisations like ours and all of the people on the panel, as well as helping the press to get some of that through to the public. And things that would help with that would be more consistency in data, the infrastructure that Jeni talked about, and us understanding why some of these things are being published, when they're being published, and just helping to make it more usable.
I have a question for all of you in the panel. One is, can you think of an example of work that you've done with an FOI or any type of government data that has made a difference and maybe made government more efficient? And number two is, do you think it should be taught in school? The fact that there is government data, how to find it, how to use it, what to do with it. Ben, do you want?
I can't think of any way in which I've improved government. I have done some research on parish councils. This is a big ambition. And we used freedom of information to assess whether it worked better to ask via freedom of information or ask via a non-legal approach. And we actually found that freedom of information worked better, not only at getting them the information, but also at getting them to go beyond what the law asked and publish on their notice board and in their minutes the information proactively, even though they didn't have to. I'll give you an example from an unnamed government department. It's one of the most useful FOI requests I've ever heard of. Somebody asked this Department X how many staff worked in the department, and the department admitted to me they didn't actually know how many staff they had until somebody made that request. So I suppose that's pretty helpful. Should it be taught in school? Absolutely. I think one of the big drawbacks to the whole argument about the armchair auditors is, numeracy. If you think through what an armchair auditor would need for local government, it's almost an impossible list. You'd need an interest in local government, you'd need a knowledge of local government finances, you'd need a knowledge of data, and you'd need lots of spare time and expertise. And, present company possibly accepted. That's a pretty rare kind of combination of things. So I think the more that people learn to think numerically in terms of data, the better it will be.
Jeni?
So you asked for an example of work done with data that's actually made a difference. So we have a whole bunch of stories on the ODI website that you can go and have a look at. The one that came to my mind, and Gavin already mentioned City Mapper, but the fact that so yesterday or the day before, they have announced this new bus that they are running around from Blackfriars around to Waterloo, makes that come to my mind. And the reason is that City Mapper was an organisation that was founded on the open data published by TfL. That's the whole reason that it exists, and the whole reason that it has been able to grow to other cities is because they've been able to tap into open data there as well. But the step that they are experimenting with at the moment to actually deliver public transport through the data, informed by the data that they are collecting, because so many people use their application, I think is just really interesting as a different way of government functioning. So that's the one that I'll throw out there. And then in terms of whether data handling should be taught in school, I mean, it already is in some ways. I mean, my kids are going through their exams at the moment, and data handling is one of the topics there, one I get particularly excited about helping them with their revision on. For me, then, there are different kinds of skills that also need to be taught. It's not just about, not everybody is going to be a data analyst when they grow up, but everybody needs to know the basics about what data makes possible, and be informed enough, have a basic level of data literacy that enables them to make informed choices when they are presented with privacy statements about collecting their data, etc. So there's a basic level of data literacy which actually goes beyond teaching people how to do data science, right, and teaching people maths. It's actually about the power of data and the way in which data is used in our society, and that I think is really important to teach at school.
I was just wondering, because there's some of my colleagues wouldn't touch a spreadsheet with a barge pole. They would just, and I thought there's that fear in a lot of people of spreadsheets.
Yes.
So have we used openness to make government more effective? It would be really embarrassing if I had no examples to give at this point. Luckily I do. Some smaller ones. So for instance, cabinet committees are really important things that help to make government decisions. After Theresa May became Prime Minister, that hadn't been published. We got tired of waiting, put in an FOI request, and suddenly it got published a few days later. I think more importantly, we hope that the work we do in taking government data and building up a picture, quite literally through loads of charts, of what departments look like is helpful to people in government, so they can better understand their departments. We know that one particular example of that is what we call our grade spaceships. You may have seen these strange blue images floating through Twitter, social media, and on our website, which try to visualise departments according to where, which grades people are in, which makes big delivery departments like work and pensions look like St Paul's, and the Cabinet Office look rather unfortunately like a coffin. So we know that some of those, we know that some of that has actually been used to make management decisions about what the workforce should look like. I think generally also just working with that volume of government data, not just about Whitehall, but now with Performance Tracker through public services and how they're performing as well, allows us to get a much better handle on how government could be using this and how we might encourage it to do so. So we had a number of tables around how transparent certain government departments were, which we know has been helpful internally to encouraging people to publish their data. But also we put some of that around financial transparency to that PACAC inquiry that I mentioned, which actually took on board quite a lot of the things that we'd said about what government departments might do. So hopefully there is still more improvement to come as those recommendations are taken up. Should things be taught in school? Well, obviously that goes beyond the remit of the Institute for Government, but I think it's really important that the civil service has the right capacity and capability to be able to utilise those sorts of skills to make government more effective. So there's that.
Oh, wow. The gentleman in the second row.
Bob Morris, as Ben has mentioned, we work together at the Constitution Unit, but I have previous as a civil servant. You seemed a bit ashamed, all of you, about not being able to point to very concrete outcomes. And I'm here to lift that shame from you. I mean, it's very interesting to see how much of the discussion had been about data rather than the policy implications, which, of course, open government was mostly focused about or sold as. And there is a sense in which it's been oversold, obviously. And we've now a rather more modest and useful expectation. That this has resulted in better data is a fascinating outcome, actually, and a very important one, I think, and much more important perhaps than little squabbles in the bureaucratic machine that the Act forces you into over open government itself. But taking a larger thing, are we talking about it'd be wrong to expect very precise or clearly conceptualized outcomes. What we're looking at, really, your point about the ecosystem, is it's a cultural change. And you don't expect necessarily very precise outcomes, but by God, has behavior changed.
The lady with the blue blazer. Thank you.
I'm Hadley Beeman. I'm a freelance technologist. As most of you know, I've been a fan of openness for a long time, but most recently I've been working on privacy and security. So I'm curious for the panel's thoughts on privacy where it relates to open data. We have personal data in some of our open data around things like senior civil service salaries and hospitality to ministers. And we made some decisions in 2010 and 2011 about sort of where the democratic lines are drawn. We now have much more data with which to correlate personal data that comes from government or from anywhere. You can connect it to what's going on for that individual on Facebook, or what you can get from Experian about them, or leaked data like the Panama Papers about them. As I imagine most of you have seen, Politico today released their crowdsourced visitor log for the White House, which has spawned a conversation about privacy there, where all of the visitors who had been visiting President Trump had I believe, had this, no one had told them not to expect privacy in the context of their visit. Now, an awful lot of stuff is going public based on observations and, crowdsourced information. So my question to all of you is, have the personal and privacy boundaries changed? Do we need to look at them again? Or do you think that they're in the right places now?
Okay, anything else? Gentleman over here. And then...
Thank you. Joe Dilger, I'm a governance consultant, and linking into the question just asked, also chair of governors at North London Secondary School. One quick comment and one question, please. In terms of the comment, and when I've been training governing bodies over the last few years, and I found that the Ofsted data dashboard tool, which pulled together a lot of key information in just a couple of pages for governing bodies, was very useful. So you could see where the attendance of your school was on an objective basis against other schools. That was useful. I thought that was a good use of information without putting too much information out there, which governors as volunteers wouldn't look at. And the question relates to, we've largely covered in discussion so far about freedom of information, and I'd just like to ask the panel about data protection, particularly in terms of, as of May 2018, there will be the new EU General Data Protection Regulation coming in, which will apply to all organisations in the UK, including government, with strengthened rights around, for example, data portability, and how the panel think that that will affect both government behaviour and effective government, please. Thank you.
There's a lady over here.
Thank you. Sue Cameron. I think Bernard Woolley, Sir Humphrey's sidekick, once said, I brief, you leak, he is prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act. In that context, we were told yesterday that new proposals by the Law Commission to reform the 1989 Official Secrets Act could lead to the imprisonment of civil servants and journalists for disclosing information that would be available to anyone asking for it under the Freedom of Information Act, according to the Campaign for Freedom of Information. I think the plan, the plot, is to change the threshold from likely to cause harm to international relations, defence, law enforcement, to capable of causing harm to defence, international relations, etc., which is much, much broader. What do you think of this? What do you think the Law Commission's playing at, and how do we stop them?
We're just going to answer these for now, if you want to start.
In terms of policy, of course, the Freedom of Information protects a lot of the policy-making areas, and Jack Straw's independent commission actually confirmed that. But I think it is important to look back 30 years or so and think about how different government is in terms of openness. Remember, at the 1980s, it was reminded to people that even the brand of tea drunk by a minister was a state secret, and it was possible still to be punished by the Official Secrets Act for doing so. Just jumping to the last point about the Official Secrets Act and the changes. This is a very worrying. I suppose one reassurance would be, how effective would it be? One of the points about the Official Secrets Act, particularly as it existed in the 20th century, was it was very difficult to use and prosecute. I suppose the other problem would be the kind of mirror image that we saw with the proposed changes to freedom of information in 2015 and 2016, is that if the media and others get hold of it, there will be such a fuss that it won't be possible to push this through. It looks too draconian. My hope would be that it simply looks too bad to do in a very different era from kind of the late 1980s, which was when Thatcher last reformed the Official Secrets Act. And just in terms of privacy, I think privacy is the area of huge political risk, both for embarrassment for politicians, but also for individuals themselves, and of course the General Data Protection Regulation. Two thoughts about what it might do. The positive hope is it will also assist with this kind of backstage issue. It will help with promote better records management across government and a greater concern for privacy. a bit like the Data Protection Original Act did, of course. But also what's interesting, watching the debate go on, is how much misinformation and misunderstanding there is about what exactly this regulation will do, the EU's possibly parting gift to the UK before we leave. And I think one of the dangers is that not many people really understand what it will or won't do, and rather like the Data Protection Act itself, there'll be all sorts of myths about what sort of effects it's going to have, which may have far more influence than the reality.
Oh, Jen?
I'm just going to pick up on the 2 points around privacy. I think so. We have a way of describing the spectrum of access that you can get from closed data to open data, and my usual spiel about it goes that personal data can fit anywhere on that spectrum. Data that is about individuals might be closed, most likely is closed, but could be shared with other organisations and could in some cases be open. And the example I always give is MPs' expenses, because we kind of expect to be able to scrutinise those. So your question, Hadley, was about where we draw those boundaries about which personal data we expect to make open. The only kind of guidance that I've seen on that I find compelling is that the greater the amount of power you have, the less your privacy is worth. And therefore politicians, and particularly those who have great power, their data should be much more open than those of us that are just general citizens, right? Now, I don't know how that translates into an operational practice, and I don't know how that translates into an operational practice where people's power changes sometimes overnight, right? But I think that that's the only kind of rule of thumb that I've seen that was compelling to me. On data protection and GDPR and with government, I think these issues really come down to, I think, what is the fundamental challenge that government has around its handling of individuals' data, which is how does it promote trust in the populace about how it is handling that data. And that trust, I think, has to be built up through demonstration of ethics about the handling of that data, which goes beyond basic data protection principles, and it goes beyond what actually what GDPR gets organisations to do. And at heart, then that ethical handling also has to involve engagement and dialogue with people about the handling of data, and it has to be transparent and open, I think. So I would expect and hope that the GDPR, etc., would provide more of a focus on that building of trust in the handling of personal data. But how that pans out, I don't know.
I have very little to add to what everybody else has said, but just to amplify that sort of last point from Jeni, I think with both privacy and with GDPR, it's very important that the public understands exactly what's going on. Clarity is really important, but also involving the public in some of those processes and engaging them. Getting user feedback on how data is actually being used helps you to sort of get through some of those issues. And one thing that sort of sits above all of that is we are starting to face new challenges, especially with personal data, that perhaps government hasn't had to deal with before. What's the right mechanism to adapting to that? I know something that's been in a few sort of political party leaflets in recent memory, and I think it was in Jeni's data manifesto, which she tweeted recently as well, is that one idea around that might be some sort of council on data ethics, which is able to sort of skill up and be able to respond to challenges like that.
Maybe two or three more questions. I'm just going to go in the back. There's a gentleman there. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew Clark, a Media Network. Considering quite a lot of the examples around open data successes have been in sort of local policy issues around service delivery and also around citizen participation. So if you think about community policing, education, schools and things like that, can we really judge whether open government is going to be more effective government until that kind of narrative of open government has been taken down to local government, particularly as we're in an era of decentralisation? I wonder if the panel has any thoughts on that.
There's a man with a blue jumper right at the back.
Andrew Smith. With the direction of travel seem to be against open data, if you had to offer up, or open government, if you had to offer up a sacrificial lamb, as it were, either something that's not working very well or something that's not useful or too expensive, what would you offer up as something we can get rid of, just to say that we're doing something to get less open?
Just one more. Lady with the red glasses. Thank you.
Hi, Suzanne Piotrowski from Rutgers University, and I study open government in the United States, federal government recently. And so I've been listening, interested, and there hasn't been a lot of discussion on data quality. And I think if the same conversation was taking place in the US, there'd be a lot of discussion on data quality. There are a lot of data sets put online. There are a lot of very fancy web interfaces, but there's a lot of real problem with the quality of the data. So I was just interested to hear your thoughts on that.
I'm glad I'm not a panelist, because I would just carry on talking about that and ranting. Ben, please.
Local government, open government is local government, would be my argument. Actually, the Freedom of Information Act, successive central governments were very keen on local government openness, very keen on other people's openness, as somebody said. So actually, it began there, and we should keep our eye on local government experiments, which have been going on under the radar for the last 10 years. Also in, open budgeting and all sorts of things like that, which is where the interesting things could happen. Will the new Metro mayors use this as a device? It's very interesting. The Metro mayors haven't got quite as much power as people were hoping for. I think the Mayor of London's just appointed a new data officer. So we should really keep our eye at the regional and devolved level to see what sort of interesting things are happening. What sacrificial lamb, what ballast could we get rid of? I suppose, here's the danger. If you start backing down on bits of openness, when you suggest one change, lots of other people have all sorts of other recommendations. So as soon as David Cameron suggested that the veto be altered, suddenly people were talking about fees protecting decision making. There's a kind of window of attack, and everybody tries to jump through it once they get the opportunity. There's an attempt to change FOI roughly once every 18 months since it's been passed. My argument would be to do a different thing and try to lower people's expectations. Openness is part of a trend that helps things, but it's not just FOI on its own, it's not just open data on its own, and the changes may not be discernible. One of the problems is that politicians come in with very high unrealistic hopes, then get rapidly disappointed, disillusioned, and within 18 months they're suggesting changes. So I would argue that it's politicians' expectations. Data quality is a huge issue when I was researching local government spending. And when I looked myself across local government, hugely varying amounts of data. Some local authorities hugely transparent about what sort of money they were spending. Another person once told me, he used to work for a local authority, you'll never find out how much we're spending on flowers, because it was put there in such a way as you couldn't ever discover it. And it is a huge complaint. I'd recommend the Scottish Information Commissioner, the former Scottish Information Commissioner, as of last week, Rosemary Agnew, published a final report urging us to rethink issues about records management, data, and consistency of proactive publication. She's urged a rethink of ideas around openness and FOI, and to bind them together to deal exactly with these issues of data quality and consistency that kind of dog both FOI and open data.
So on local impact, I think that I think it's absolutely right that getting people engaged locally is what makes a difference. I think where there are challenges is that getting a critical mass of data and people in the same area that can actually make a difference at a local level is quite hard. In particular, building tools that are sustainable requires you to have, products and services that are sustainable, requires you to have an audience that is quite large, a prospective user base that is quite large. And if you're only focusing on a local area, then that can be a challenge. Which is why having standardization across different data sets so that your tool can be applied in different localities, et cetera, it becomes quite important. On the sacrificial lamb, I'm glad that was a very good answer, Ben, because I couldn't think of anything. But what I would say is rather than dropping things, is more focus on a few things and do them really well. And I think that there's so much to do in data, full stop, and there's so much to do in open data, so much to do in transparency. There's so many things that you could be doing that it becomes very, your effort becomes very spread very thinly. And that means that you need to actually be picking some battles or picking some areas where you think you can really make an impact. And I think it's concentrating effort rather than saying these things are simply not important, saying this is really important and focusing effort on those things. And on data quality, I mean, every talk that I'm ever in goes to data quality, so fantastic, it has done here too. The thing I would say about data quality is recognising that opening up data actually can drive up data quality, both because of the process behind it, because people get worried about releasing data that they don't think is good quality and therefore hold off releasing it until it is, but also actually that publication of data that is poor quality, has gaps in it or errors, you can use the eyes of the crowd in order to correct that. So an example is actually the Open Banking Initiative recently had publication of the ATM locations from the core banks within the UK. If you looked at where Barclays ATMs were, they were out in the middle of the sea in some cases, or in Africa, or all sorts of places, right, that were simply not accurate. But the fact that it was open meant that somebody could get hold of that, they could run that analysis, and they could feed back the corrections to that, which is a good thing for Barclays, because it really needs to know where its ATMs are. So it actually drives up data quality within an organisation as well, when you are open to and bold enough to open up that data for other people to look at.
Very quickly, Andrew, in terms of local government, I think metro mayors do provide a really good opportunity to try to start doing some of that. And there's almost a sort of sense of experimentation. Different places might do different things, and we can learn from the best examples. Already some really interesting stuff going on, not just in the UK, but in the US as well. I mentioned Baltimore, Maryland, but also New York, the Office of Data Analytics there. And there is something vital about bringing it down to that level where it makes difference to people's lives. I didn't think I'd be quoting Oliver Letwin from a select committee hearing 6 years ago this evening, but I'm going to. He was before one of the committees talking about the government's decision to change from public service agreements as a performance management tool to, was it departmental business plans, and trying to make data open. And he was talking about this, and one of the MPs on the committee said, Oliver, forgive me, if I were campaigning on the doorstep and I said, we're moving from PSAs to business plans, it's really important, I'd be laughed off the doorstep, which might be happening to quite a lot of members of Parliament at the moment, who knows. Letwin's response was, people might not care about that, but they do care about the performance of their child's school, they care about whether their grandmother's got their hip replaced, and it is trying to bring it down to that level where it means something to people, which will make everything really powerful. Sacrificial lambs, I'm tempted to ask Andrew what you would get rid of, but I'd just echo what Jeni and Ben said, and I think actually focusing and using what's already out there and demonstrating the value of why that thing should still be published is really important. Data quality, Suzanne, how long have you got? I think we've probably hit every problem you could imagine. Government departments being referred to in different ways in different data sets, which makes it really difficult to compare. Really pleased that the Government Digital Service is trying to do something about that and bringing together a sort of register of government organisations. Numbers which have clearly been signed off when they're false. One department which seemed to be spending more than its entire budget on a single budget line because it was using the wrong currency. But I think the fact that that was spotted was because people were using it. And we hope that more that data is published, the more that we're able to use the data, point out to departments where there are errors, get them to use that data themselves, dog fooding in terms of using our own data, to refer back to that wonderful term from earlier. I think those are some of the mechanisms how you improve that.
Great, thank you. That's all we have time for. Thank you for asking some really great questions, and thank you for coming, and thank you to the panelists.